I was 26 the first time something circled our tent and left a mark that I still can't explain. I tell people I was an IT contractor who needed the quiet of a dead creek and a rusted fire ring to stop thinking about rent and exes. The truth is simpler. I liked the way the dark smelled out there. Damp pine, cold earth, the metallic tang of old rain. And the way a flashlight beam made everything feel like it belonged to a different era. I'm telling you 3 things that happened to me and people I camped with, because if I don't say them aloud, they stay lodged in my chest like a pebble. If you like this kind of real-feeling horror, stay till the end and subscribe. I'll have more. If it unsettles you, share it with someone who needs to be warned. The first trip was with Kevin and Mara. We were broke seniors, trying to squeeze one last cheap escape into the shoulder season before finals ate our souls. The spot we found was a dispersed clearing off a forestry road, a flat like a forgotten parking lot with a dying creek about 30 yards away. There was a ring of stones half buried in leaves and a collapsed boulder that made a decent windbreak. We set up the tent, started a small fire with damp twigs, and joked about the ghosts of campers who never left. The sky was pinpricked and cold. We cooked noodles out of a plastic pot and drank cheap gin from a thermos. Kevin hummed off-key, while Mara scrolled a playlist on her phone. The screen light made their faces 2 lighted islands in a dark sea. Early signs were so small I barely filed them away. A line of tiny stones. Someone had stacked 3 on top of each other at the edge of our clearing, like an accidental cairn. The fire kept going out of its own accord until we prodded it with a stick. A smell that wasn't smoke or wet pine, like old animal and ammonia, floated over from the creek. At dusk, we found a strip of cloth pinned under a rock on the log where we left our packs, a scrap of red flannel frayed at the edges. We laughed it off. Someone was probably cleaning a campsite nearby. People leave things. People get careless. Around midnight, after the gin and the laughter thinned into a steady sense of quiet, we heard something walking. That's the only word for it, walking. Not the uneven scurry of a raccoon or the hopping of deer, not the breathy, distant howls I'd learned to catalog as faraway coyotes. This was heavy, deliberate steps that moved around the perimeter of our clearing in a slow, patient circle. It came with a rhythm, step, scrape, pause, like someone counting out the paces as if measuring the space. We froze. Mara hissed for us to be quiet. Kevin, ever the lookout, unzipped the tent and stuck his head out with a flashlight. The beam picked up nothing but the wet leaves and the dark trunks. The light carried only around 5 yards. We could hear the steps now, almost immediately beyond where the light reached, shifting as if someone was grazing just outside the cone and staying out of sight. I thought of a prankster at first. College kids, too many beers and too few boundaries. I imagined a smirking face far enough away to be safe. Kevin called out, "Yo, come on, man, show yourself." His voice was too loud in the dark. The steps stopped, then resumed, closer, as if reluctant. Something brushed the guy lines of the tent. A small shuddering sound, like a hand tracing the canvas. We packed then, clumsy and whispering, stuffing sleeping bags and rolling out the tent. Every sound was amplified. Our breath, the rustle of nylon, the gravel underfoot. As we shouldered packs, I saw it. scratch marks on the nearest young pine, a series of shallow notches carved in the bark like tally marks. 7 lines, a slanted 8th line crossing them. The tree was barely thicker than my wrist. Whoever had been circling us had left that there, right in our path. We didn't take time to think. Kevin grabbed Mara's hand and we ran to the truck, the flashlight beams bobbing. The steps followed, but not loudly, more like a presence stepping through the underbrush with a patient, even cadence. When we fired up the truck, we watched the clearing in the beams of the headlights. There were no silhouettes, no glow of a camp like ours. But just inside the tree line, under the branches, someone, something, had stacked more stones in a little pile, smooth rocks balanced in a small tower that hadn't been there earlier. It sat like a quiet accusation. We called the ranger station the next morning. They came with polite expressions and notepads. The ranger said there were always pranksters, always drifters, always people passing through, but he did walk the trees and photographed the notches. Probably just kids, he said. Nobody asked about the stones. We scrubbed the tent, tossed the flannel into a trash bag, and ate breakfast in a diner with cheap coffee that tasted like dishwater. We tried to move on. Kevin got quieter after that trip. Mara stopped accepting late-night texts from strangers. I kept a little pebble, one of the 3 from the first stacked rock, in my glove compartment for a year. One morning I found it on my porch, not in the glove compartment, just sitting on the mat. It wasn't mine anymore. Someone had walked up to my apartment and left that stone, like a punctuation mark. The second story happened 2 summers later, with Allie and Seb. Allie and I were on the mend from a messy breakup, hers, and she wanted the woods because she said the trees made her feel smaller, which made the world more manageable. We took a car down a service road that flaked into a 2-track, then parked at a clearing near a ridge. There was a low, flat mesa behind our site where you could see for miles when the leaves thinned. We set up the tent on a slight incline, the kind that made sleeping feel like you were tilting into sleep. On the second evening, a man walked up to our camp while we were making dinner. He said his name was Aiden and that his truck had broken down up the road, though he was oddly specific about the area and gave the impression he'd been roaming those parts for days. He had a long coat and hands that were clean but trembling. He asked for matches and struck a lighter with a fatalistic clack. He watched Allie as if memorizing how she held the spoon. When we offered him a water bottle, he declined, said he preferred to keep moving. He left before dusk, walking up toward the mesa with a slow, purposeful gait. We watched his silhouette recede. That night, between the time we crawled into the tent and when sleep should have come, there was a sense of being observed. Not in a theatrical way, but like the woods themselves had leaned in. We heard a low rumbling from the mesa, almost like stones shifting. Allie woke me when something hit the tent, a dull thud along the fly that set our teeth on edge. It happened again, and then several times, rhythmed like someone pacing. I unzipped a strip and peered out. A headlamp bobbed on the ridge, stationary, then gone. We whisper-hushed each other and stayed still. At about 1 in the morning, the knocking started on the tent zipper, soft but urgent. Allie grabbed my arm and squeezed until my hand hurt. I whispered for her to stay down and not to make noise. The zipper was pressed at the seam, the nylon bulging inward as if fingers were feeling for an entrance. We had a small .22 in the truck,
Seb insisted on bringing it. He'd had it for hunting. I hated the sound of the safety being clicked off. I told myself out loud we wouldn't use it unless we had to. The knocking became a scraping, like nails pulled across fabric, moving in a slow line around the tent's perimeter. Then someone whispered our names in a voice that was too close and too layered, multiple threads of breath at once, like wind through a stack of cardboard. Ali, Ali. The voice was the wrong timbre for Aiden's, last shape in my memory. It was softer, more coaxing. Ali started to cry. I couldn't move. When the zipper finally gave way, a hairline and the flap fluttered, there was nothing there. Not a shadow, not leaves disturbed, not even a crushed patch of grass. Only a single object left on top of our cooler where we had stored the food, a dead squirrel, arranged on its back with its paws crossed over its chest, and on the animal's belly someone had pressed wet earth into little hatch marks. There were 7 marks, precise, crude, like someone counting. Seb's face when he saw it later in the morning was blank. He drove to the highway, hands white on the wheel, and we left without breakfast. We told the highway patrol. They took statements with that air people reserve for things that sound like stories.
They photographed the squirrel and the marks and spoke about predators and territory, how some animals arrange things. They were polite, professional, no real follow-up. We never saw Aiden again. His truck was never found. Ali would not camp for a year after that, and when she finally did, she chose a group site with a host and night patrols. She sleeps with earplugs now and wakes sometimes screaming names I don't recognize. The third thing was my own fault, which I mean in the softest way I can. An experienced outdoorsman is not infallible. I knew knots and trails and how to read weather on the smell of the air. I'd been alone that weekend, a 3-day push to clear my head after losing a job. The spot was low and thick with birch, a narrow bend in a back road where a creek made a small pool. The bank smelled of rot and riverweed. I found the place by following a game trail that narrowed into what looked like an old campsite, a rust ring sunk into the earth, stones arranged half-heartedly, and a line of stacked pebbles marking something like a threshold. I set up my small solo tent, a single skin, and gathered kindling. It was late afternoon when I found the first sign. Someone had tied a short strip of nylon to a sapling a few yards from my door. The knot wasn't military. It was rough and looped, a marker. I shrugged and retied it with my own cord. That evening I ate cold beans and stared at the flames until they died. The sky was thick with cloud, and the creek sounded like a distant motor. I fell asleep with the flashlight in the tent pocket. At 2 in the morning, I woke because of the counting. It was faint, rhythmic, irregular, and yet insistently human. It sounded like someone whispering numbers, 3 syllables apart, soft enough to pass as some trick of the wind. 1, breath. 2, breath. 3. The pattern had a cadence that burrowed under my bones. I thought of rats with numbers and then dismissed it as silly. The noises circled the tent, sometimes near, sometimes further, like someone pacing and using the counting as a metronome. I unzipped, keeping my hand on the flashlight, and stepped out. The cold air hit my face. There was a small pile of stones at my tent flap now that hadn't been there when I closed up.
7 stones balanced into a narrow cairn. Beside it, propped into the softened earth, was a small stake with a dead squirrel pinned to it, its belly scored with a ring of marks. I felt my stomach drop to some animal place of fear I can barely name. I grabbed my pack and started to make noise, since noise often scares predators, human included. I clanged a cookpot with a spoon. I shouted at the dark. The counting continued, but it was different now. Multiple voices, overlapping, like a chorus out of time. At one point, a voice directly behind me said something I still remember, because it was clear as a throat clearing. Stop counting. It draws them.
I didn't think about the trail or my shoes sinking in the mud. I ran blind through the birch, branches clawing my face. Behind me, the counting sped up into a staccato, like someone flicking pebbles across tin. I hit my truck with a scraping sound and slammed the door, hands shaking so badly I could barely find the key. I drove out without headlights, because lights seemed to attract movement, or perhaps because I was afraid of what I'd see. When I reached the highway and turned on the dash, my rear view showed nothing but the dark of the forest. I don't know how I made it home. The aftermath of those nights is less dramatic than you hope. There were no arrests, no formal investigations that led anywhere. Friends drifted. Some said I overreacted. I learned not to tell new romantic partners about the tally marks, the stones, the dead animals. There are 2 ways the woods got into me. One way was physical, the stacks of stones, the notches, the pinned animals. And the other was slower, psychological. I started to notice patterns everywhere. 7 kept appearing in stupid places. An elevator dings 7 times. A coworker mentioned 7 as a number in an offhand comment. Once, months after the first trip, I woke to find 7 small pebbles bordering the soap dish in my bathroom. I asked who left them. No one knew. There's an idiom in the outdoor community about leaving no trace. It's practical. Pick up your trash, bury your waste. But I think the real rule we broke, if there is a rule, is not to disturb boundaries that someone else has marked, even if those boundaries are just quiet rituals. We assumed those marks were jokes, pranks, or natural accidents. We assumed a human explanation fit. Maybe that's what I want to believe, because accepting something else means you have to admit you were vulnerable to something older and more patient. I still go camping sometimes, not often. I am more careful now. If there's a pile of stones, I leave it alone. If there's a notch in a tree, I photograph it and then back away. I learned to make the mundane into a shield, label things as left by humans and left by animals and unknown, as if naming the fear makes it less amorphous. But the names don't erode the feeling. Once, sitting at a gas station on the way home from a quick overnight, I saw a child stack 3 little rocks beside a soda machine, precise and quick. I felt a surge of nausea that I couldn't explain, because how could a small act at a gas station remake the skin of a night in the woods? There are other small, persistent things. My tent still carries a faint smell that is not pine nor rain, something like old fur and iron. At times when I'm half awake, I swear I hear the cadence of counting, soft and patient, just beyond the wall of my apartment. Once, at a party, someone I barely knew joked about counting things, and I excused myself and went outside. I have become someone who checks locks twice and who does not sleep with the windows open unless I'm 5 stories up. If you hear footsteps around your tent and they do not fit the animal patterns you know, if you find stacks of stones or tally marks carved into young trees, do not assume it's brunch hour pranksters. Do not assume there will be a satisfying explanation. The world will often give you plausible reasons because humans like neat endings. Sometimes the neat ending is a ranger with a clipboard who says kids and pranks and sorry for your trouble and hands you a pamphlet. Sometimes the neat ending is a stone on your porch and the knowledge that someone else, somewhere, pays attention in a way you don't want. I keep telling these stories because telling them makes them less like private terrors. Saying them out loud is an attempt to trade the weight of the secret for the nakedness of speech. But every time I say them, a detail moves in my stomach. The pile of stones was never just a pile. The counting is not random. The marks are deliberate. I don't know who was walking around our tent those nights, and I'm less sure than ever that I want to know. I'm going to stop here for now. I told myself one more rule after that. Document, don't dramatize. If I ever saw anything again, I would take a photograph, note the time, the weather, the exact placement of stones. Evidence, I told myself, was a kind of antidote to fear. It made the world accountable. So, when I found 3 pebbles lined along my back step the morning after I moved into the apartment across town, small gray river stones placed like someone had taken their time, I didn't scream. I put on shoes, crouched, and took a photo with my phone. I left the stones where they were, close enough to the door that anyone leaving the building would see them. For all the soothing logic I fed myself, the sight of them tightened something behind my ribs. The photo did nothing to soothe me. I looked at it until the pixels rearranged into possibilities. Kids playing, a neighbor with a neat habit, a prank. The phone's timestamp read 6:12 a.m., the hour when the city is still claiming sleep. I scrolled through the old conversations until the names thinned into silence. Nobody replied with a plausible explanation. The building's manager didn't remember seeing anyone. Cameras, where they were installed, had frames too grainy, too pat to capture any gentle, precise hand. After the stones, other things arrived. Small, patient escalations that felt less like messages and more like corrections. A single notch cleanly into the underside of the mail slot. 3 faint tally marks scratched into the inside of the stairwell's handrail. An empty juice bottle on the stoop turned to show its cap removed and set between 2 cracks in the concrete like a tiny sentinel. Each time I found one of these signs, I documented it, then I washed my hands as if I could scrub the attention off me. Documentation is a kind of witness, but witness requires a tribunal of people. I tried to convene mine. I showed a photograph to a man I had known in college. We used to build crude kayaks out of tarps. And he frowned at the image and said, "That's creepy," which is a word without teeth. I showed another to a woman at the office who liked rules and lists. She said someone must be lonely, maybe a neighbor who liked arranging things. Neither offered the kind of curiosity that carried weight. Neither came to stand beside me on a porch at 2 a.m. and say, "Let us see." After a while, the documentation felt stupid and indulgent. It was proof that only mattered to me. The stones kept coming.
One night in late autumn, I drove back out to the place where we'd camped the first time, because leaving a mystery unresolved felt like abandoning a child. The road narrowed and then narrowed further until I turned onto the gravel access that led under the pines. Moonlight slipped between branches in long, pale fingers. I realized halfway through the drive that I hadn't packed a flashlight. In the months since the first nights, I had tried to outsmart the dark by refusing to furnish it with excuses. Maybe the absence of a light was some sort of parity. If I'd fled without confronting it before, maybe now I could meet the dark on my own terms. I parked at the same culvert and walked in, feet already sinking into the soft black of the path. The air smelled of wet leaves and something old, the tilt of it like the memory of an animal. My breath came out as a loose, small cloud. It felt oddly private in a place that had once felt crowded with attention. The camp was where we'd left it, collapsed poles, a smudge where the fire had been. But the perimeter had changed. There were stones again, arranged at intervals along the ring of trees as if someone had set invisible posts and crowned them with cairns. The formations were different from before, smaller groups, careful arcs, and in two places perfectly vertical slivers of wood wedged into the soil like stakes. I moved slow, hands in my pockets, as if any sudden reach might finish a sentence I didn't want read. My mind catalogued observations: moss on the north side of an old stump, the way the stones lean to the east, a piece of blue fabric caught on a branch. The counting cadence I'd heard in fits and starts over the years, that soft, patient enumerating, seemed to be present in the spacing, the rhythm of placement. 3, then 2, then, always, a 7 somewhere. There was no fire now, but in the center of the ring lay a small, carefully stacked monument. 7 tiny stones balanced like eggs, one on top of another. They looked impossibly calm. I crouched to get a closer look. The stones were smooth and wet with sap. In the base stone seam I saw a tiny notch, a tally scratched so shallow it might have been weather or mightn't. I took a picture. The camera's flash rose and fell like a pulse.
When the light left, a whisper of movement at the edge of my vision made me lift my head and breathe too quickly. I wasn't alone. There was the impression of a thing moving with a deliberate slowness beyond the half-dark, a step that didn't quite belong to a person or an animal. It was a shift of sound and absence, like a page being turned in a room with closed doors. "Who's there?" I said, because the ritual of naming can sometimes call people out of absence. The word left my mouth too loud in the hush. No one answered. The trees did not rustle in the manner of casual wind. They held themselves like an audience. The rhythm of my heart beat in my throat, but the counting, that patient, distant cadence, surfaced anyway, as if the woods began again the slow job of accounting. I found another set of marks on a sapling not far from the cairn. 7 notches. They were fresh enough that the pale wood bled a darker line where the bark had been taken away. The edges were clean, as if cut by a blade designed for ritual rather than whittle. I touched one with the pad of my finger. It was not exactly warm, but it bled an oil that smelled faintly of ants and iron. At the edge of my sight, a shadow detached itself from behind a tree and resolved into the slender shape of a child, or someone small enough to pass for one, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large. They stood with hands in pockets and head cocked, watching me with a kind of patience that made my scalp prickle. For a moment I felt relief,
stupid as it was. Human presence contained possibility, explanation, apology. "Hey," I said, "do you belong out here?" The figure tilted its head, and the space between us tightened into an exchange that didn't require words. Then, as if in a single slow motion, a hand emerged from the pocket and set 3 stones gently on the ground between us, arranging them into a small, precise line. The child, whatever they were, turned and walked away without looking back. I wanted to follow, but also knew every impulse of pursuit would be a mistake. The child vanished into the trees as if they had always been part of the understory. I stood, feeling foolish and ancient and very tired. I left the camp exactly as it was and walked back to the truck, breathing like someone who had run a long way. 2 days later, on my kitchen counter, there were 3 stones, each smaller than the palm of my hand, forming a neat row between the salt shaker and the knife block. I had locked the door, the windows were latched, there was no way in the mundane sense. I put my hand flat on the cool laminate and counted them out, 1, 2, 3. I left them there until night, until my own rule about documentation felt ridiculous. Then I put them in a shoebox and slid it under the bed. After that, sleep no longer felt like an expectation, but an experiment. I learned to wake at odd hours and sit on the edge of the bed and listen for the counting.
System. I sat very still and listened until the counting rose again, close and patient, as if someone were tallying the time by which I had arrived and the time by which I might leave. It said 1. I drove home with my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, and when I unlocked the door, the hallway smelled of wet fur and iron. The pebbles on the step were gone. I do not go out into the woods to place stones anymore. I have learned instead to notice where they place themselves. The world has subtle rules. I learned, late, stubbornly, that attention is not always a defense. Sometimes looking is an invitation. Tonight, when I got in from work, there was a new notch on the doorframe inside my apartment. Thin, deliberate, exactly the height of a child's hand at the first joint. 7 notches. I pressed my thumb against them. They were not carved by accident. I took a photograph, and then, after a long while, I set my phone face down. I made a slow coffee and sat with it until the sun had long seeded the sky. The counting that night came as something very close and very soft, not from the walls and not from the woods, but from somewhere in the space between my kitchen and the window. It is restful in a way. It is patient. I started this talking because naming the terror was a small act of resistance. I keep writing because silence has weight, and because wherever the counting goes, my memory seems to follow. Perhaps the most honest thing I can admit is this. I do not know whether the marks are meant for me, or whether I have merely become the only one able to read them. I do not know if there is a beginning and an end to the ledger that someone, or something, keeps. But the ledger keeps getting longer. Tonight, before I put the kettle on, I glanced down and counted the notches I had always kept to myself on the inside of the cabinet where I stash batteries. 1, 2, 3. Small, everyday economy. When I reached the 4th notch, there was already another next to it, fresh as a confession. I did not make it. I set the kettle back down without turning it on. Outside, my neighbor's radio played something soft and comfortingly human.
The counting continued on my kitchen counter, slow and without hurry. 1, 2, 3. I am writing because the act of writing creates a trail. If you find this and the numbers mean something to you, perhaps you'll understand what I cannot yet name. If you have your own stones, your own notches, please treat them with a kind of cautious reverence. Some boundaries are not polite to cross. The door is open. There is a light in the street. For the first time in a long while, I feel the shape of something like a plan, but it is not yet a resolution. I will go back out. I will bring paper, maybe tape the notches to a board, count them until the numbers make a sequence that fits something larger. I will try to force a grammar where only the counting exists. For now, I put this down and listen.
Outside, beneath the hush of summer insects and plains, something counts my window's reflection as if tallying the panes. 1, 2, 3. The kettle whistles, a small human sound. I let it cease. The counting keeps time. I am tired of being catalogued and tired of the compulsion to answer. Still, a part of me wants to know how long the ledger runs back, who keeps it, and whether there is a line in it where my name appears and ends. I will go back to the ring. I will set stones. I will see whether the world will accept my placing beside theirs. I am going to the woods in the morning.